History has a way of making the most powerful people on Earth seem invincible. We see them in bronze statues, on gold coins, and leading massive armies across thousands of miles. They command the fate of millions with a single word. But behind the velvet curtains and the heavy stone walls of their palaces, even the most legendary figures are bound by the same biological clock as everyone else. The transition of power is the most dangerous moment in any civilization, and how a leader leaves the world often changes the course of history more than how they lived in it. Today, we are analyzing the final moments of the most famous world leaders in detail. We aren't just looking at the official reports. We are looking at the medical mysteries, the sudden departures, and the dramatic exits that left entire empires in shock. This is the ultimate guide to the end of an era, and it reminds us that at the end of the day, every titan of history is eventually reclaimed by time. To begin our journey, we have to look at the ancient world, where the transition of a leader was rarely a quiet affair. Take Alexander the Great, for example. In the year 323 BC, he was the undisputed master of the known world, having conquered everything from Greece to India. He was only 32 years old, and in the prime of his physical life. Then, after a long banquet in Babylon, he suddenly became ill. For 12 days he suffered from a high fever and excruciating pain. By the time his generals gathered around his bed to ask who should inherit his vast empire, he could only whisper the words, "To the strongest." Many theories have emerged over the centuries. Some suggest he succumbed to a natural ailment like malaria or typhoid fever, which were common in the marshy regions of Mesopotamia. Others point to more sinister possibilities involving his inner circle. Because there was no clear successor, his empire was immediately torn apart by his generals, proving that when a leader departs unexpectedly, the world they built often goes with them. Moving to ancient Rome, we see a pattern of departures that were far more orchestrated. Julius Caesar is the most famous example. He had gone from a successful general to a dictator for life, fundamentally changing the Roman Republic. But his peers felt he had gained too much authority. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, Caesar arrived at the Senate, unaware that a group of his own friends and colleagues had decided his time was up. The transition wasn't caused by illness, but by a collective decision to force a change in leadership. Caesar's departure didn't save the Republic as the conspirators hoped. Instead, it triggered a series of civil wars that paved the way for the first Roman emperor, Augustus. Augustus, interestingly, had a much more peaceful exit. After ruling for over 40 years, he passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 75. His final words were reportedly, "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." It was a rare moment of grace in a city known for its violent transitions. As we move into the Middle Ages, the reasons for a leader's departure often became tied to the conditions of the time. King Richard the Lionheart, the legendary crusader, met his end in a way that seems almost trivial compared to his grand battles. While inspecting a siege at a small castle in France, he wasn't wearing his full armor. A young boy on the castle walls shot a crossbow bolt that hit the king in the shoulder. In an era before modern medicine, the wound quickly became infected. Richard knew he was fading, and in a final act of chivalry, he had the boy brought to him and forgave him. He passed away shortly after, leaving his kingdom to his brother, John. This reminds us that even for a warrior king, a single moment of being unguarded can change the fate of a nation. In the East, the great Genghis Khan, who founded the largest contiguous land empire in history, as a departure shrouded in mystery. The official version says he fell from his horse during a campaign against the Western Shia. Others suggest he suffered from a lingering illness or even complications from a wound. What is most fascinating is what happened after he left. According to his wishes, his body was taken back to Mongolia and buried in a secret location. Legend says that the funeral escort eliminated anyone they met on the way to ensure no one would ever know where the Great Khan rested. To this day, despite the best efforts of modern archaeology, his final resting place remains undiscovered. He went from being the most visible man on Earth to a ghost in the landscape. The Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment brought a different kind of ending for leaders, often tied to the shifts in political philosophy. King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, ruled for an incredible 72 years. He transformed France into the center of European culture. But his departure in 1715 was slow and painful, caused by a condition called gangrene in his leg. He had spent his life building the magnificent Palace of Versailles, but in his final days he advised his 5-year-old great-grandson not to follow his example of expensive warfare. He realized at the very end that the glory he chased had left his country exhausted. In contrast, the French Revolution introduced a much more abrupt method of transition. King Louis XVI was the last absolute monarch of France. As the social order collapsed, he was removed from power and became the center of a national trial. In 1793, the invention of the guillotine provided a mechanical and public end to his reign. This wasn't just the departure of a man. It was the symbolic dismantling of the divine right of kings. It showed that the people had the power to reclaim the authority they had once given to their leaders. The founding of the United States gave us a different model. The leader who steps down voluntarily. George Washington could have been a leader for life, but he chose to retire after 2 terms, setting a precedent that would last for over a century. However, his departure from life was sudden. In December 1799, after riding his horse in the snow, he developed a severe throat infection. The medical practices of the time, which included extensive bloodletting, Washington faced his end with the same stoicism he showed in battle, his final words being, "'Tis well." He was the first leader of a new kind of nation, and his quiet exit helped stabilize the fragile democracy he helped create. As we enter the 19th century, the scale of global leadership expands. Napoleon Bonaparte, who once controlled almost all of Europe, finished his days in a very different way than he expected. After his defeat at Waterloo, he was sent into exile on the remote island of St. Helena. He spent 6 years in a small house, far from the battlefields and palaces of his glory days. He passed away in 1821, with many historians believing he suffered from stomach cancer, a condition that also affected his father. There have been long-standing rumors of arsenic being involved, but modern testing suggests that while he had arsenic in his system, it was a common environmental factor at the time. Napoleon's journey from being the master of Europe to a lonely prisoner in the middle of the Atlantic is one of history's most dramatic examples of the rise and fall of power. The mid-19th century in America saw one of the most tragic departures in history with Abraham Lincoln. Having successfully navigated the country through the Civil War, Lincoln was attending a play at Ford's Theater just days after the conflict ended. In a moment that shocked the world, he was approached from behind by an individual who disagreed with the new direction of the country. This was the first time an American president was removed from office in such a violent way. Lincoln lingered for several hours before passing away the next morning. The loss of his leadership during the Reconstruction of the South changed the path of American history for the next 100 years, proving that the timing of a leader's departure is often as important as their actions. The 20th century brought about even more complex and globalized transitions. Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom had become the symbol of an era. She ruled for 63 years through the heart of the Industrial Revolution and the height of the British Empire. When she passed away in 1901 at the age of 81, it felt to many like the very foundations of the world were shifting. She left behind a world that was technologically and socially unrecognizable from the one she was born into. Her departure was peaceful, surrounded by her family, but it marked the definitive end of the 19th century. In contrast, the leaders of the mid-20th century often met much more chaotic ends. The departure of the leader in Germany in 1945 occurred in an underground bunker as the forces of the opposition closed in from all sides. He realized that his vision of a 1,000-year empire had collapsed in just 12 years. Rather than face a trial or capture, he chose to end his own story. This was a moment of total collapse, not just for a leader, but for an entire system of thought. It was a messy, dark ending for a man who had caused so much misery across the continent. At the same time, the Soviet leader during World War II, who had turned the USSR into a superpower, also faced a lingering end. In March 1953, he suffered a massive stroke in his private dacha. Because he had spent his life creating a culture of fear, his guards and his staff were terrified to enter his room when he didn't emerge in the morning. He lay on the floor for hours without medical attention because no one wanted to be the one to disturb him without permission. When his inner circle finally arrived, they were more concerned with how his departure would affect their own power than with saving him. He passed away several days later, his final moments a direct reflection of the system he had built. Lonely, paranoid, and surrounded by people who were looking for an opportunity to take his place. Modern leadership transitions in democracy often happen through the ballot box, but we still see the shock of sudden departures. John F. Kennedy's exit in 1963 is perhaps the most analyzed event of the last century. While traveling in a motorcade in Dallas, he was hit by a projectile fired from a nearby building. The speed and public nature of the event, captured on film, created a trauma that stayed with the nation for decades. It sparked endless theories and investigations, as people struggled to understand how such a charismatic leader could be taken so quickly. Like Lincoln before him, Kennedy's departure occurred at a pivotal moment in the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, leading many to wonder what the world would have looked like if he had finished his term. Further south, the departure of Che Guevara in the mountains of Bolivia in 1967 represents a different kind of ending. He was a revolutionary who had helped lead a change in Cuba and was trying to spark a similar movement in South America. After being captured by the local military, the decision was made to finalize his story in a quiet, rural schoolhouse. He faced his end with a sense of defiance, reportedly telling his captor to pull the trigger because he was only taking the life of a man. His image went on to become a global symbol, showing that sometimes a leader becomes more powerful in their absence than they ever were in life. In the Middle East, the departure of Anwar Sadat of Egypt in 1981 shows the dangers an innovative leader faces. Sadat had made the bold move of signing a peace treaty with Israel, a decision that earned him the Nobel Peace Prize, but made him a target for extremists within his own borders. During a military parade in Cairo, a group of soldiers suddenly broke rank and directed their intentions toward the viewing stand. Sadat was removed in a burst of activity that happened in front of live television cameras. His exit was a reminder that for a leader, peace can be just as dangerous as war. The end of the 20th century saw the departure of Princess Diana, who, while not a formal political leader, held a level of global influence that rivaled any prime minister. Her departure in a Paris tunnel in 1997, following a high-speed chase involving photographers, triggered an unprecedented outpouring of global grief. It changed the way the British monarchy interacted with the public and highlighted the intense pressure placed on those who live their lives in the spotlight. It was a tragic modern ending that felt like a localized failure of the digital age's obsession with celebrity. More recently, the departure of Nelson Mandela in 2013 was a global event of a different nature. After spending 27 years in prison and then leading South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy, Mandela became a global symbol of reconciliation. He passed away at the age of 95 due to recurring lung infections. Unlike many of the figures we've discussed, his departure was expected and provided a moment for the entire world to reflect on his legacy of forgiveness. He showed that the greatest strength a leader can have is the ability to leave behind a world that is better and more peaceful than the one they inherited. We also have to look at the departures that involve deep medical mysteries. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the only American president to serve 4 terms, led the U.S. through the Great Depression and most of World War II. He had spent years dealing with the effects of polio, but it was his cardiovascular health that ultimately gave out. In April 1945, while recovering in Warm Springs, Georgia, he suddenly complained of a terrific headache and slumped over. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. This happened just weeks before the end of the war in Europe and before the first use of the atomic bomb. His departure left Harry Truman, a man who had been kept in the dark about many of the war's secrets, to make some of the most difficult decisions in human history. Then there is the case of King Tutankhamun of ancient Egypt. For thousands of years, people wondered why such a young king had passed away. When his tomb was discovered in 1922, the mystery only grew. Recent scans of his mummy suggest that he didn't leave due to a conflict or a plot, but rather from a combination of genetic conditions and a severe injury to his leg that became infected. For a king who was buried with such incredible wealth, his exit was likely a very quiet and physically taxing experience. It's a reminder that even the most adorned tombs hold the same story of biological fragility. The psychology of a leader's final moments is often telling. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who stood against the expansion of the Axis powers, lived to be 90. He had suffered several strokes toward the end of his life. His final words were reportedly, "I am bored with it all." For a man who had lived through the most exciting and dangerous events of the century, the quiet of old age was perhaps the most difficult challenge of all. He had done everything a man could do, and he was ready for the transition. In contrast, Peter the Great of Russia, a man of massive stature and even more massive energy, met his end after an act of physical bravery. According to legend, he saw a group of soldiers drowning in the icy waters of the Gulf of Finland and dove in to save them. The resulting chill and subsequent infection led to his departure shortly after. He was a leader who never stopped working, even when it cost him his life. His final act was consistent with his vision of himself as the first servant of the Russian state. The reasons for the departure of world leaders are a reflection of the times they lived in. In the past, it was often the consequence of conflict, infection, or a shifting social order. In the modern age, it is more often a result of the long-term effects of stress or the inevitable aging process. But in every case, it represents a moment of profound change. When a leader leaves, a vacuum is created, and how that vacuum is filled defines the next chapter of history. Think about the leader of the Zulu Empire, Shaka Zulu. He had built one of the most powerful military machines in Africa, but his departure was caused by his own family. Following the passing of his mother, his actions became increasingly unpredictable and harsh. His brothers, sensing that the empire was at risk, decided to bring his reign to a close in 1828. It shows that for a leader, the closest people to you are often those who will determine your end. This same story is seen in the Roman emperors like Commodus, whose own inner circle decided that his behavior was no longer sustainable for the state. We also have to consider the leaders who vanished without a clear explanation. In the early colonial days of America, the governor of the Roanoke colony, John White, returned from a trip to England to find his entire settlement gone. This wasn't the departure of one leader, but of an entire community. To this day, we don't know if they moved, were assimilated, or met some other fate. It is one of history's greatest missing person cases involving a leader. In the 20th century, the departure of Pope John Paul I after only 33 days in office sparked decades of rumors. The official cause was a heart attack, but because no autopsy was performed, people speculated about everything from banking scandals to secret societies. It reminds us that when a leader is in a position of spiritual or global authority, the public demands a level of transparency that wasn't always available in the past. The departure of a leader is also a moment of intense mourning and ritual. The funeral of John F. Kennedy, with the riderless horse and the eternal flame, was designed to provide a sense of continuity in a moment of chaos. The elaborate mummification of the pharaohs, or the massive mausoleums for modern dictators, are all attempts to defy the finality of the transition. They want to turn a leader into an idea that can never truly be removed. But as we've seen, the physical reality always remains. One of the most unsettling departures was that of King George V of the United Kingdom in 1936. It was later revealed in the diaries of his physician that the king was given a combination of substances to ensure that his departure would occur in time for the announcement to be made in the morning edition of the Times, rather than the less prestigious evening papers. It was a cold, calculated decision to manage a leader's image even in his very last moments. Why does this matter to us today? It matters because it reminds us of the importance of stable institutions. A country that relies entirely on one person is a country that is always one heartbeat away from a crisis. The history of the world is full of examples where the departure of a single figure led to years of civil war, economic collapse, or social upheaval. The most successful societies are those that have built systems that can handle the transition of a leader without falling apart. When we explain every departure reason in detail, we see that the end is rarely as heroic as the life. It is often a messy, human, and unpredictable process. Alexander the Great's world was shattered by a fever, Lincoln's by a theater's dark corner, Roosevelt's by a headache. These are small causes for such massive effects. It highlights the butterfly effect in history, where a tiny biological or localized event can change the destination of the entire planet. The finality of a leader's departure also provides a moment of perspective. Once the power is gone, all that remains is the legacy. Did they build something that lasted? Did they improve the lives of their people? Or did they leave behind a trail of sorrow? In the final moments, the gold and the armies don't matter. What matters is the answer to Augustus's question, have I played the part well? As we look across the centuries, we see a global family of leaders who all faced the same common end. From the emperors of China to the presidents of the West, the story is always the same. They are people who were given a great responsibility, and eventually that responsibility had to be passed on. Their departures are the closing of a door, but they also open a window into the nature of their era. We learn about the medicine of the 1700s through Washington's end. We learn about the politics of the Roman Senate through Caesar's. We learn about the tensions of the 1960s through Kennedy's. The history of world leaders is a history of humanity itself. It is a story of our attempt to organize ourselves, to find purpose, and to strive for something greater. But it is also a story of our limitations. No matter how high a person climbs, they never reach a point where they are beyond the reach of time. This should give us a sense of humility. We are all living in a time that will one day be someone else's history. The reasons for these departures, illness, accident, age, or conflict, are the same reasons we face in our own lives. The difference is the scale of the impact. When an ordinary person departs, it is a tragedy for a family. When a world leader departs, it is a turning point for a civilization. But the underlying biological reality is identical. The crown and the scepter are just borrowed for a time. In describing these final moments in detail, we find a sense of connection to the past. We can imagine the fever of Alexander, the shock of the Roman Senate, the cold of Washington's final ride. We see these legends not as distant icons. We are the inheritors of everything these people built and everything they broke. By looking at their end, we can perhaps find a better way to manage our own beginnings. It's been a journey through the heart of the human experience, and I hope it's given you a new perspective on the names you see in the history books.